My name is Carolyn Chalmers and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Professor Mervyn King's Good Governance Academy. When the board is the governance risk themselves, you have a big problem, because that's where the fish rots from the head, as they say. That's where it all starts. So let's just think about some classic governance problems, governance risks that sit at the board level. So first of all is a dysfunctional chair. It's pretty much, you can't get worse than that. So we have some classic examples in South Africa where we have dysfunctional chairs, and really the only person that can help the board in that position is to point it out, I think, is the Chief Audit Executive primarily, and then supported by the company secretary who is in the meetings themselves. Of course, then another issue is when you have collusion really between the board chair and the chief executive officer or the accounting officer. So you have a big problem there because it's really to the exclusion of everyone else in the room. I think an underlying problem with those issues is the issue of conflict of interest. And a conflict of interest can be perceived by the company secretary in the room. Certainly it can be demonstrated through not making decisions in the best interest of the organization. And if the Chief Audit Executive is present, of course they will see it. But often the Chief Audit Executive is not present in the room at the time. So what can the CAE do outside of the room? And I think the best course of action is really to ask for the rationale behind decisions that have been made. So when minuting board minutes, you often get resolutions, who said what, and the COSEC, the company secretary, and the board themselves make sure that that is accurate. But the rationale behind that decision making, if that is not recorded, of course, then you never know what went in, and the conflict of interest can absolutely be in the room alone. So for the Chief Audit Executive as an independent vision of or viewer of those board minutes, if they can ask, well, what was the rationale for the decision, and let's make sure that it's in the minutes, then we can start getting a little bit more accountability, certainly more active record keeping and record visibility of what's going on in the boardroom. Very difficult position to be, but the Chief Audit Executive, having an independent role, is the ideal person to be able to call it from that perspective. So two things really. The one is around representative board members, and the other one is really on the basis of management versus governance. So if I start with the representative board members, either appointed by a shareholder, perhaps in the case of a medical scheme by members, or in the case of pension funds by pensioners or members again, or in the case of state-owned entities or state-owned organizations, it's appointments by government, by the ministers to these organizations. And I think the recurring theme I see is that that director doesn't understand how to act in the best interest of the organization as opposed to who they're representing. So if they can, if we communicate around that, the representation is that you are in the room when the discussion is being had. So you are bringing that perspective to the room that the rest of the board members perhaps didn't have. And that is your representation. Of course, shareholder representatives can get very good at negotiation and boardroom tactics and things like that to get their way in the boardroom, and all the board members I'm sure will be doing the same. It's up to the chair to make sure that this is fair and equitable and transparent. But once they leave the room and, well, they've made the decision, that decision has to be in the best interests of that organization, the long-term best interests of that organization, not in the best interests of, they're not voting in the best interests of whoever appointed them. I think that's a recurring failure I'm seeing over and over. And then as soon as they leave the boardroom, we need to understand that they're representing a collective opinion. So the second most prevalent issue I see in boards across Africa is The distinction between governance and management, I like to use Peter Drucker's term, the management guru. He says leadership is about doing the right thing, and management is about doing those things in the right way. And I can personally relate to that, is that having been a coder, or in my days was called a programmer, I left those days a long time ago as I moved into management and leadership, etc. So those people actually know the best way of doing things now. I long left that. But the right things to be done, that comes from experience and, dare I say it, wisdom. So that is, for me, the difference between management and governance. Governance is really, what are the right things to be done? And then management does that in the right way. But what we see happening is that, first of all, either from a governance perspective, we get too much interference in what is the right way. But the other aspect is that management then provide the board with information that is about the way, and instead of providing board with the information that they can actually use to govern. So by presenting single figures, for example, the board doesn't know what to do with that. The board needs trends and comparisons with others, and to be able to say, well, is that within the parameters that we're putting in place? So I think those are the two biggest issues. Is the one, as a representative director, who are you representing? And then when you're in the meeting, making a decision in the best interest of the organization. And the second one is the division between governing and managing from both angles, from perspective of the manager providing information to the board, and the board then critiquing the information that the manager is providing. I think there's a lot of training on governing the business, and when you're governing the business when it comes to information security or artificial intelligence or subject areas, there's not a lot of training on the business of governing. So what is it to make a informed decision? What does that mean? Has anyone actually defined that and explained it? Or asking pertinent questions, or asking questions of management. That's a skill, and we need to learn those skills as board members. Then the other thing is acting in the best long-term interests and legacy building and intergenerational value creation. Now, as you're growing up through an organization, you're acting as a tribal leader, really. You're trying to do your best with the resources around you, making sure you deliver for today's deliveries or tomorrow's deliveries or the financial year-end results. As a director, you are looking at the longer term. You are legacy building, and that's quite different, and it's very difficult to train something like that, but there are skills that we can use. So I do think there's lots of training on how to govern the business, minutes and all of that kind of thing, but in terms of the business of actually governing, there's very little around that.